My name is Emily. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words that sound polite, but land like a lid closing. Easygoing, practical, low maintenance, the calm one. I'm a mother first. Everything else, my job, my routines, the way I speak softly even when my chest is tight, has always been built around that core. I've never been the loudest voice in any room. I don't fight to be seen, I don't interrupt, I don't perform my pain for an audience. And because of that, people often mistake my quiet for permission. They assume I won't notice the small manipulations, that I'll smooth things over, that I'll accept whatever is decided for the good of the family, as long as everyone keeps their tone pleasant. I've watched people underestimate me my entire life, not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of convenience. It's easier to overlook a woman who doesn't demand attention. This story isn't about a dramatic villain or a perfectly scripted revenge arc. It's about something colder than that: paperwork, power, and the slow realization that love can be used as a cover for control. It begins in a way that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. My husband transferred our child's birth certificate without my consent, not as a mistake, not as a misunderstanding, as an action, as a decision he made about our child, about our family, about me, without my voice in the room. And the way I found out wasn't from him sitting me down, confessing, apologizing, or even explaining. I discovered it when the school said I was no longer listed as a parent, just like that. An administrative sentence delivered in a neutral tone, like they were telling me I'd filled out the wrong form. What follows is not chaos. It's not screaming matches or smashed dishes. It's the kind of unraveling that happens quietly. Late nights at the kitchen table with a laptop glow, phone calls that end with ma'am and long holds, the careful rereading of documents, the sudden awareness that the ground under your family can be shifted by someone who smiles while doing it. You'll hear about the way my marriage looked from the outside, how stable, how normal, and the invisible patterns inside it that I kept excusing because I didn't want to believe what they added up to. You'll hear how I moved from shock to clarity, and how clarity doesn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it arrives like a door, clicking shut behind you. I'm not telling this to stir drama. I'm telling it because what happened to me is the kind of thing people don't imagine can happen until it does. And if you've ever been the quiet one, you know how easily quiet can be mistaken for weak. Before we begin, have you ever had a moment where someone changed the rules of your life without asking and you only realized after the fact? To most people, I was dependable background noise, the kind of woman you count on without really seeing. I handled schedules, permission slips, pediatric appointments, and birthday gifts for nieces I rarely saw. I remembered everyone's allergies. I knew which school secretary preferred email and which one only responded if you called before noon. I kept the household running smoothly enough that no one ever asked how much effort it took. And I didn't correct them. In my marriage, I was described as supportive. That word came up often. Friends would say it admiringly. My husband would say it with a soft smile, as if he were proud of how little friction I caused. Supportive meant I didn't argue unless something truly mattered. It meant I trusted his judgment. It meant I was flexible. What it also meant, though no one said this part out loud, was that my agreement was assumed before it was given. I was the parent who attended every school event, but I wasn't the one teachers initially addressed when big decisions came up. They'd look past me, searching for him, even though he rarely came. I was the one who filled out the forms, but my name felt more like a placeholder than an authority. Mom is a term rather than a person with legal standing. At family gatherings, I was the listener. I remembered conversations people forgot they'd had with me. I absorbed opinions without challenging them. When something bothered me, I'd make a mental note and move on. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed that stability was built on choosing your moments carefully. I told myself that being calm was a strength, and it was, but it was also convenient for everyone else. My husband liked to say we were a team, and in many ways we were. We didn't fight loudly. We didn't air our problems. From the outside, we looked aligned. What people didn't see was that alignment often meant I adjusted my position to match his, quietly and incrementally, until I wasn't sure when I'd last stood firmly in my own. He was decisive. That's how people described him. A planner, a problem solver. When something needed to be handled, he took care of it. I trusted that phrase more than I should have, because it sounded like protection when sometimes it was just control dressed politely. I wasn't naive. I noticed things. I noticed when conversations happened without me, when decisions were summarized rather than discussed, when my input was acknowledged but not integrated. Each time, it was small enough to excuse a timing issue, a misunderstanding, a harmless assumption. And I told myself, this isn't worth creating tension. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet women. We're not unaware. We're weighing cost, emotional cost, familial cost, the cost of being labeled difficult after years of being praised for being agreeable. So I stayed in the role I was assigned, steady, reliable, invisible when necessary. At school events, I stood slightly to the side. In meetings, I let others speak first. At home, I absorbed the emotional fluctuations so our child wouldn't have to. I believed that consistency was love. That restraint was maturity. What I didn't realize then was how clearly everyone else understood my role. They knew I wouldn't make a scene. They knew I wouldn't accuse without proof. They knew I wouldn't react impulsively. And somewhere along the way, that knowledge became a risk factor I didn't see coming. Because when people are certain you won't push back, they start pushing further, quietly, administratively, with signatures and forms and conversations that don't include you. I didn't know yet that something fundamental had already shifted, that a decision about my child, about my legal identity as a parent, had been made without my consent. At that point in my life, I still believed that if something truly serious happened, I would be told. I was wrong. The first sign wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it easy to dismiss in hindsight. It came disguised as efficiency. I remember my husband mentioning, almost casually, that he had handled some school paperwork while I was making dinner. He said it the way people do when they expect praise for being helpful. I nodded, thanked him, and kept stirring the pot. It didn't occur to me to ask which paperwork. School forms were my domain, but occasionally he stepped in, usually when a deadline was tight. That was the explanation my mind accepted without resistance. A few days later, I received an email from the school addressed only to him. Not copied to me, not CC'd, just him. It was about a minor schedule update, dismissal times for an upcoming half day. I saw it only because he forwarded it with a short note, FYI. I felt a flicker of something then. Not anger, more like displacement, as if I'd reached for something familiar and found it move slightly to the left. I told myself it was nothing. Email systems glitch, admin assistants guess, people make assumptions. It wasn't worth interrogating. That's how the first small cut happens, not with pain, but with a rationalization. Over the following weeks, there were a few more moments like that. A call returned to him when I had been the one who left the message. A teacher referred to him as the primary contact in passing. Each time, it registered. Each time, I smoothed it over internally. He probably listed himself first. They must have updated their system. This doesn't actually change anything. I didn't want to be the woman who nitpicked administrative details. I didn't want to sound territorial over something as obvious as my role as a mother. Surely that didn't need defending. What I didn't realize was that while I was interpreting these moments emotionally, someone else was interpreting them structurally. One afternoon, I stopped by the school office to drop off a form. The receptionist smiled politely, took the envelope, and asked me to confirm my relationship to the student. "I'm her mother," I said, still smiling. She paused, just a second too long. Then she said, "Okay," in a tone that wasn't questioning but wasn't confirming either. That pause stayed with me longer than it should have. At home that evening, I mentioned it lightly to my husband. I framed it as a joke. The school almost acted like they didn't know who I was today. I laughed when I said it, signaling that it wasn't a problem. He barely looked up from his phone. "Their system's a mess," he said. "I wouldn't read into it." And again, I didn't. That's the thing about the first small cut. It's survivable. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand immediate attention. You keep moving because stopping feels excessive. But internally, something began to shift. I became more observant, less trusting of summaries. I started noticing how often information reached me secondhand. How frequently were they described as already finalized by the time I heard about them? Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed silence preserved peace. I didn't know yet that silence can also preserve imbalance. The truth is, everyone else ignored these moments because they didn't affect them. The school staff followed whatever the system told them. Friends assumed everything was fine. My husband treated the changes as logistical, not personal. I was the only one who felt the accumulation. I remember lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, replaying those small interactions. Not with panic, but with an unfamiliar sense of alertness. Like a part of my mind had sat up straighter. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that I started remembering details instead of dismissing them. That was the first cut, not the one that hurt, but the one that taught me where to look. Once something is framed as normal, it stops sounding like a warning. That's what happened next. What began as isolated moments slowly arranged themselves into a pattern, not sharp enough to alarm anyone else, but consistent enough that I felt it in my body before I fully admitted it to my mind. Information started arriving late, or filtered, or summarized. I already talked to them, my husband would say casually. They said it's fine, he'd add, as if that ended the conversation. At first, I appreciated it. That's what partnership is supposed to look like, right? Sharing the load, dividing tasks, one person steps in so the other can breathe. But over time, I realized I wasn't being relieved. I was being removed. Parent-teacher communications shifted almost entirely to him. When I emailed, responses were slower and shorter. When he emailed, they were prompt and detailed. It wasn't personal, it was procedural. Systems respond to what they're fed. And someone had fed the system a version of our family where I was secondary. I noticed that when decisions were made, my role was to be informed, not consulted. The language mattered. I let them know. I agreed to. I signed off. I started to ask gentle questions, not accusations, clarifications. Why did they change that? Did they ask for both of us? Can you forward me the confirmation? Each time the answer was smooth, reasonable, slightly patronizing without being overt. You worry too much. It's not a big deal. They don't need both parents for this stuff. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I let that logic settle. I told myself I was being sensitive, that motherhood had made me overly vigilant, that questioning every administrative detail would exhaust me, and possibly strain my marriage over something that didn't matter. So I quieted the questions. I normalized the discomfort. I started adjusting my expectations instead of challenging the behavior. When I wasn't copied on an email, I assumed I'd get the summary later. When a form was submitted without my signature, I told myself maybe it wasn't required. When my name was missing from documents, I convinced myself it was just formatting. This is how disrespect becomes invisible, when you do the emotional labor of making it make sense. I still showed up, still volunteered, still attended every event, but I noticed that people addressed me differently now. Not with suspicion, just with a certain lightness, as if my presence was optional rather than authoritative. One teacher once said, "We already cleared that with her dad," when I asked a question. Cleared. The word landed heavier than it should have. I smiled, nodded, and said, "Okay." That okay became a reflex. At home, my husband grew more confident in his role as intermediary. He spoke for the family more often. He explained decisions to me instead of discussing them. When I raised concerns, he'd reassure me, not by answering them, but by minimizing them. "You trust me, don't you?" It wasn't a question designed to invite honesty. It was a test. And every time I passed it, the boundary shifted a little further. I rationalized my silence as maturity, as emotional intelligence, choosing long-term stability over short-term conflict. But deep down, something else was happening. I was being trained to doubt my own authority, not through force, through repetition. And repetition is powerful. It makes the imbalance feel earned. It makes exclusion feel logical. It makes you complicit in your own erasure. I remember one evening organizing old school files, realizing how many documents had his name alone where mine used to be. I stared at the stack longer than necessary, trying to pinpoint when that change had occurred. I couldn't. That's when I understood something important. Normalization doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, while you're busy being reasonable. By the time you recognize it, the behavior has already established precedent, and precedent is hard to undo. Still, I didn't confront him, not yet, because part of me still believed this was unintentional, a misunderstanding amplified by systems that favor whoever speaks first, signs fastest, and asserts most confidently. I believe love would prevent anything truly harmful. I hadn't yet realized that love doesn't stop someone from using power. It just makes it easier to hide. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that what was happening wasn't accidental. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because I lacked the framework to see it clearly. I had been assigned a role, and I had been performing it well. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the inconvenience so others didn't have to, the parent who adjusted, the partner who trusted, the woman whose value came from being low friction. That role didn't require authority, it required reliability. And reliability, I learned, is easy to exploit. In conversations, my husband spoke with certainty. He used phrases like, "We've decided," and "This works best for us," even when I hadn't been part of the decision. When I gently corrected him, I wasn't aware of that. He'd smile and say, "Well, you agreed when we talked about it." We hadn't, but challenging that would have meant contradicting him in front of others, creating discomfort, becoming the problem, so I stayed quiet. I started to see how smoothly the system worked when I did. Teachers trusted him because he sounded confident. Administrators followed his lead because he spoke in conclusions, not questions. Family members deferred to him because I didn't counterbalance his narrative. And I realized something unsettling. My silence wasn't neutrality, it was an endorsement. I had mistaken calmness for powerlessness in others. And in doing so, I'd underestimated how much power my presence actually carried when I chose to use it. But at that point, I wasn't using it. I was still telling myself that my role was supportive by nature, that not everyone needs to lead, that families function best when roles are complementary. That explanation comforted me, until I noticed how rarely roles are assigned by mutual agreement. They're assigned by behavior, and mine told a clear story. I noticed how often people turned to me for emotional labor, but not for decisions. How my insights were welcomed in private, but excluded from outcomes. How my husband relied on my organizational skills behind the scenes, while presenting himself as the face of our family to the outside world. I was the infrastructure, invisible until something went wrong. One afternoon, a friend asked me how I felt about a school change my husband had apparently agreed to. I hadn't heard about it. I smiled, covered, and said, "If he thinks it's best, I trust him." The words tasted hollow. Later that night, I replayed that moment. Not with anger, just clarity. I had been slowly edited out of my own family's public identity. Not erased, softened, backgrounded. And I had allowed it, because I believed pushing back would disrupt harmony. But harmony built on omission isn't harmony, it's compliance. That realization didn't explode inside me, it settled. I didn't confront him, I didn't accuse, I didn't demand explanations. Instead, I started watching more closely. I paid attention to what required signatures, to which documents were considered routine, to how systems defaulted to whoever showed up first with confidence and paperwork. I noticed how often my name was described as optional, and I began to understand the role I'd been given, not just by my husband, but by everyone around us. The reliable one, the quiet one, the one who wouldn't make trouble. That role came with expectations, and expectations come with limits. I hadn't yet crossed them, but I was getting close, because something in me was changing. Not outwardly, internally. I wasn't angry, I was alert. And alertness is dangerous to systems built on assumptions. At that point, I still believed that if I stayed observant, if I gathered enough context, I could gently correct course without disruption. I didn't yet know that the course had already been altered without my consent, and that the role I'd been assigned was about to collide with something far more concrete than perception. Paper, authority, and a line that once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where I stood up and said enough. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place so familiar I almost missed it. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight angled across the surface, just enough to show the dust I never quite got rid of. Our child was at school. The house was quiet in that midday way that feels borrowed, like silence you're allowed to hold only temporarily. I had my laptop open, reviewing a calendar reminder for upcoming enrollment confirmations. Nothing urgent, just routine. The kind of thing I'd done 100 times before. I clicked into the school portal to double-check a date, and that's when I saw it. My name wasn't there. At first, I assumed it was a loading issue. I refreshed the page, logged out, logged back in, still gone. Under parent/guardian information, there was only one name listed. His. No secondary contact, no alternate guardian, no emergency backup. Just him. My reaction wasn't panic, it was disbelief. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for context to appear. A note, a disclaimer, something that explained why a mother who had filled out every form for years had suddenly vanished from the system. Nothing came. I checked older confirmations saved in my email. My name had been there before, not as an afterthought, not as optional, as an equal. The air in the room felt different then. Heavier, but not dramatic. More like the quiet you feel right before you realize something important has already happened. I didn't call my husband. I didn't message the school immediately. I sat there, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to soften the moment with explanations. I didn't say it's probably a mistake. I didn't say there must be a reason. Instead, I asked myself a simpler question. How would this have changed without someone submitting documentation? Because systems don't remove parents casually. They require forms, signatures, intent. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not emotionally, but structurally. I stopped interpreting. I started assessing. I opened a new folder on my computer. I labeled it with the date. Nothing dramatic, just factual. Then I began pulling records, emails, previous enrollment confirmations, screenshots of current listings, calendar notes. I wasn't upset. I was methodical. That surprised me. I realized then that the part of me that had been quiet wasn't passive. It was patient. And patience, when paired with clarity, becomes something else entirely. I finally called the school. I kept my voice calm, neutral. I asked for confirmation, not correction. The administrator paused, just like the receptionist had weeks earlier. Then she said it. "I'm sorry, but according to our records, you're no longer listed as a legal parent." The words didn't echo, they settled. I asked when the change had been made. She gave me a date. I asked how it had been authorized. She told me a birth certificate update had been submitted. Submitted. Not reviewed, not discussed. Submitted. I thanked her for the information and ended the call. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I closed the laptop and sat very still, because in that stillness, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This was about removal, and removal isn't accidental. That was the day I stopped thinking in terms of feelings and started thinking in terms of facts. Not because I wanted conflict, but because someone had already crossed a line quietly, assuming I wouldn't notice, or that if I did, I wouldn't respond. They were wrong. That afternoon didn't change how I spoke. It changed how I listened. It didn't make me louder. It made me precise. And precision is where real power begins. After that day, my silence was no longer automatic. It was deliberate. I didn't confront my husband when he came home. I didn't ask questions that would invite rehearsed explanations. I didn't let my shock show, because shock is information, and I wasn't ready to give mine away. Instead, I watched. At dinner, he talked about his day the way he always did. His tone was relaxed, confident. He asked about our child's homework, about dinner plans for the weekend, about things that are assumed normalcy. And I matched him, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I understood now that any emotional reaction would shift the balance back in his favor. He was practiced in navigating conversations, in reframing, in minimizing. If I confronted him without understanding the full scope of what had been done, I'd only be reacting to the surface, so I stayed quiet. That quiet wasn't submission, it was containment. I began to see how easily my previous silence had been mistaken for blindness. People assume that if you're not reacting, you're not aware. They underestimate how much information a quiet person can hold. I let him continue to assume that I trusted him. Meanwhile, I started tracking. I reviewed every school document I could access. I requested copies under the guise of updating my records. I saved emails offline. I wrote dates down, not interpretations, just timelines. I noticed how comfortable he was operating unchallenged, how freely he spoke for both of us when no one corrected him, how institutions respond to consistency more than truth. Silence, I learned, creates space, and space allows patterns to reveal themselves. I paid attention to how often my husband framed decisions as already resolved, to how frequently he referenced paperwork he hadn't mentioned before, to the casual way he spoke about authority, as if it were a given, not a shared responsibility. He never asked if I had noticed the change. That told me everything, because if it had been a mistake, he would have mentioned it. If it had been an oversight, he would have apologized. But there was nothing, no acknowledgement, no concern, just an assumption. Assumption is the clearest indicator of intent. I also began preparing emotionally, not to fight, but to remain steady. I reminded myself daily that outrage clouds memory, and memory was going to matter. I stopped explaining myself to people, stopped filling conversational gaps with reassurance. When others talked about school matters, I listened more than I spoke. They didn't notice the shift. That's the thing about strategic silence. It looks exactly like the old version to anyone not paying attention. But internally, everything had changed. I no longer needed to be liked. I needed to be accurate. I started learning, quietly, how parental authority is recognized and transferred, what documents are required, what assumptions institutions make, where loopholes exist. I didn't search in anger. I searched in clarity. Late at night, after the house was asleep, I sat at the same kitchen table and read policies. Not to scare myself, but to understand the terrain. I realized how easily someone who speaks confidently can redirect systems, how rarely those systems verify emotional truth, how much they rely on paperwork and precedent. And I realized something else too. My husband had relied on my temperament to protect him. He knew I wouldn't explode. He knew I wouldn't make accusations without certainty. He knew I valued stability. He had mistaken those traits for weakness. And in doing so, he had given me time. Time to see clearly, time to prepare, time to choose my response rather than react. Silence had become my advantage, not because it hid me, but because it revealed everyone else. And the more I observed, the more certain I became that whatever I did next had to be irreversible. Because once you show your hand, the game changes. And I wasn't ready for that yet. What they never noticed was how much I remembered. Not just conversations, but sequences. Not just outcomes, but processes. I had always been this way, quietly attentive, mentally filing details away, but before, that habit had been in service of harmony. Now, it was in the service of accuracy, and accuracy changes everything. I began by reconstructing a timeline, not emotionally, chronologically. I pulled bank statements to note when certain fees were paid. I matched them against school submission dates. I reviewed old email threads to see when language shifted from we to he. I compared document versions the way someone trained would, even though no one had ever trained me to do this. You don't need formal authority to notice patterns. You just need patience. I noticed how often my husband used urgency as a justification. They needed it quickly. The deadline was tight. It was easier if I handled it. Those phrases appeared again and again, always paired with action taken alone. I noticed something else too. He never forged my signature. He didn't need to. He operated entirely within spaces where my presence was optional by design. Spaces where systems assume one parent is sufficient. Spaces where confidence overrides verification. That told me he understood the rules better than I had. And it told me this wasn't impulsive. It was procedural. I requested certified copies of records, not as a challenge, but as a formality. I asked questions framed as curiosity. Can you help me understand how this works? People answer questions like that more freely than accusations. Every answer I received gave me more clarity. I learned which offices require both parents to consent and which don't. I learned how easily information flows when one person presents themselves as the sole authority. I learned that silence from the other party is often interpreted as agreement. That realization stung more than anything else, because it meant my previous quiet hadn't just allowed this, it had validated it. But regret wasn't useful. Documentation was. I started keeping physical copies, not just digital files that could be lost or altered, but paper, dates, signatures, reference numbers. I placed them in my leather folder, the one I'd always used for school meetings, now repurposed. No one noticed the folder getting thicker. I also started adjusting my behavior subtly. I stopped asking permission for access to information. I requested it directly. I stopped deferring conversations. I initiated them briefly, politely, without explanation. I updated my contact details everywhere I was still listed, even if my name no longer appeared prominently. I didn't correct the record yet. I observed how resistant the system was to my presence, and how quickly it accepted it when I persisted calmly. I also noticed how unprepared my husband was for this version of me. Not because I changed dramatically, but because I stopped filling the emotional space. When he spoke confidently about decisions, I nodded, but I didn't affirm. When he summarized outcomes, I said, "I'll look into that," instead of "okay." That small change disrupted the flow more than he realized. He still didn't ask what I was doing. That was the part that surprised me most. People who believe they are in control rarely check for movement behind them. I began preparing not just information, but myself. I practiced staying neutral under pressure. I rehearsed conversations where I spoke less, not more. I reminded myself that power doesn't need volume. Late one night, I sat with the folder open in front of me and realized I no longer felt confused. Everything had a shape now. I understood what had been done, how it had been done, and why it had gone unnoticed for so long. I also understood something more personal. I wasn't angry. Anger wants release. This wanted resolution. I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. I wasn't interested in humiliation or revenge. I wanted a correction, finality, a reassertion of truth that couldn't be quietly undone. And I knew with unsettling calm that whatever I chose next would change how everyone saw me, including myself. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting entirely. I was preparing, not loudly, not dramatically, precisely. The reveal didn't come with relief. It came with clarity, and clarity is heavier than people expect. I had been gathering information for weeks by then, moving carefully enough that nothing rippled outward. From the outside, everything still looked the same. Same routines, same tone, same quiet compliance everyone had grown comfortable with. But internally, I was closing in on something specific. Not suspicion, proof. The final piece arrived through a phone call I almost didn't make. I had been transferred between departments twice before I reached someone who could answer my question. I kept my voice neutral and framed everything as verification. I gave reference numbers, dates, names. I let the paper speak for me. And then the woman on the other end of the line said something that rearranged everything. Yes, she confirmed. The amended birth certificate was submitted and accepted. Amended. The word landed differently than updated or corrected. This wasn't a clerical fix. It was a structural change. I asked who had requested it. She told me. I asked whether both parents were required to consent. There was a pause, longer this time. She explained the conditions, the thresholds, the assumptions built into the process. She didn't sound defensive. She sounded factual. Systems don't have emotions, they have rules. And someone had navigated those rules deliberately. When I ended the call, I didn't move for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood the full scope of what had been done. This wasn't about convenience. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about authority. The birth certificate isn't symbolic, it's foundational. It determines which institutions are recognized, who gets automatic access, and who has standing without question. By transferring it without my consent, my husband hadn't just made a decision. He had repositioned me, quietly, permanently, at least in his mind. I remember feeling something settle in my chest then. Not grief, not fury, finality. Because once you see that someone is willing to alter reality at the root, without discussion, without consent, you can't unsee it. You can't reinterpret it as care. You can't fold it back into love. You have to respond to what it is. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't even look at him differently. Instead, I went back to my folder and added one more document: the confirmation, the date, the language used, and then I closed it. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just a quiet internal shift from discovering to deciding. Up until that moment, there had been a part of me still evaluating intent, still wondering if there was a version of this story that didn't require action. That part went silent, because intent no longer mattered. Impact did. I understood then that whatever I chose to do next couldn't be tentative, couldn't be half-measured, couldn't rely on the hope that things would correct themselves. Someone who changes a child's foundational records without informing the other parent isn't testing boundaries. They're redefining them. And I wasn't going to negotiate from a position someone else had quietly stripped away. That night, I lay awake not planning revenge, but mapping outcomes. I thought about our child, about continuity, about what stability actually means when truth is optional. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who stayed quiet to preserve peace, and how that peace had been used as cover. And I realized something that surprised me. I felt calm, not numb, calm, because uncertainty had been the most exhausting part. And now there was none. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew exactly what it meant. And I knew, with steady certainty, that I would not confront this emotionally. I would confront it structurally, privately, decisively. The reveal didn't give me power. It showed me where my power had always been and how to use it. There's a moment after clarity where nothing happens externally, but everything changes internally. That's where I was. I didn't rush into action. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. I didn't threaten, confront, or even hint that I knew the full truth. I sat with the information long enough to understand not just what I could do, but what I should do. Because when you reach a decision point like this, options multiply. I could confront my husband directly, demand explanations, insist on reversal. That would satisfy the part of me that wanted acknowledgement, but it would also alert him. It would give him time to prepare, to reframe, to adjust the narrative. I could go to the school first, force an immediate correction, create disruption, but disruption without foundation is temporary. Systems can be nudged back just as quietly as they were moved. I could do nothing, absorb it, protect the surface of our lives, pretend that being present in practice mattered more than being recognized on paper. That option existed, but I dismissed it quickly, because doing nothing would have taught our child a lesson I wasn't willing to pass on. that authority can be taken quietly if you're agreeable enough. So I weighed permanence. I asked myself, what action creates a future where this can never happen again? Not emotionally, structurally. I realized then that whatever I did had to be irreversible, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because once someone has demonstrated a willingness to erase you administratively, any temporary fix is just a pause. I needed a reset that reestablished truth at the root. That meant acting within the system, but with intention. I spent days researching quietly, not just laws, but processes. What triggers reviews? What flags inconsistencies? What requires full disclosure from all parties involved? I learned which steps invite scrutiny and which shut doors permanently. I also prepared myself for the emotional aftermath. I accepted that choosing decisively would change my marriage, that there would be no return to the version of us that existed before. That clarity comes with loss. But I also understood that staying would mean modeling erasure as acceptable, and that wasn't an option. The decision I made wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was the result of aligning my values with my actions. I chose the path that prioritized truth over comfort, the path that didn't require confrontation to be valid, the path that assumed I would not be believed emotionally but would be recognized factually. Once I made that choice, everything slowed down, not because I hesitated, but because I was waiting for the right moment to move. I prepared documents. I organized timelines. I ensured that every action I took would stand on its own, without explanation or embellishment. I stopped hoping for an apology. I stopped imagining reconciliation. I focused on correction. And correction, I learned, doesn't need permission from the person who caused the damage. It needs accuracy. That was the moment I understood something profound. Decisive action doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost boring, because when you're done debating, there's no adrenaline left, just direction. I wasn't acting to punish him. I was acting to restore reality. And once that decision settled in my body, there was no turning back. Because some choices, once made with clarity, don't allow for retreat. They only allow for follow-through. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. I felt order. That surprised me more than anything else. People assume decisive action looks like motion. Calls made, doors slammed, voices raised. What it actually looked like was a series of quiet mornings where I moved through my routines unchanged, while something entirely different was unfolding beneath the surface. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not friends, not family, not my husband. Because movement in silence requires one thing above all else: containment. I began by formalizing what I already had. I requested official transcripts of records. I asked for written confirmations instead of verbal ones. I stopped accepting "that's how it works" as an answer and started asking for policies. Politely, persistently. No one resisted. That's the part people don't expect. When you speak calmly and with specificity, systems respond. Not emotionally, procedurally. I scheduled consultations without announcing them. I asked questions framed around process, not blame. I presented timelines, not interpretations. I didn't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I needed them to understand the sequence, and they did. Each step I took was small on its own. An email here, a request there, a form submitted with careful language and complete documentation. Nothing that would alert someone watching casually. At home, everything stayed normal. My husband continued to operate under the assumption that I trusted him. That assumption made him careless. He spoke freely. He didn't guard information. He didn't check for resistance. He didn't notice that I had stopped agreeing. The agreement had been replaced with an acknowledgement. I see. I'll review that. Okay. Those phrases kept the surface calm while removing consent from the equation. I also began separating practical dependencies quietly. Not dramatically, just methodically. I ensured I had independent access to accounts I was entitled to. I verified records where my presence had been minimized. I corrected nothing yet, but I ensured that when correction came, it wouldn't require permission. I wasn't undoing his actions. I was preparing to supersede them. That distinction mattered. I paid attention to timing. Systems move slowly unless prompted correctly. I waited for windows where updates triggered reviews, where changes are required, re-verification. I learned how to let institutions do the work for me by presenting inconsistencies they couldn't ignore. All the while, no one noticed. Not because I was hiding, but because no one expected me to move. That's the advantage of being underestimated. Your silence becomes camouflage. There were moments late at night when I felt the weight of what I was doing. Not fear, responsibility. Because I knew that once certain steps were completed, there would be no quiet undoing. But I didn't waver, because this wasn't about winning. It was about restoring authorship over my own life. I never spoke badly about my husband. Not to anyone, not even in my thoughts. Character attacks would have muddied the clarity of what I was doing. I stayed focused on facts, on records, on outcomes, and slowly, invisibly, the ground began to shift. Institutions updated files, flags were raised, reviews were scheduled. None of it is dramatic, none of it is public, just movement, forward. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same systems that had allowed my erasure were now correcting it, not because of emotion, but because of structure. I didn't need to confront him to be heard. I just needed to speak the language he'd used first, and I spoke it fluently. By the time the consequences began to surface, everything was already in motion. And motion, once initiated correctly, doesn't stop because someone asks it to. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive as inconveniences first. A delayed email, a request for clarification, a meeting that suddenly needs to be rescheduled. I noticed the shift before my husband did. He came home one evening, distracted, his confidence slightly misaligned. Not shaken, just irritated in a way that didn't match the surface problem he described. "They're asking for more documentation," he said casually, like it was an annoyance rather than a disruption. "It doesn't make sense. They already have everything." I listened. That was all. Inside, I knew exactly what had happened. Systems don't question authority unless they're given a reason. And once they do, they don't stop at the surface. Over the next few weeks, things slowed for him. Requests that used to move quickly stalled. Decisions that were once rubber-stamped now came with follow-up questions. People asked for confirmation where they hadn't before. Not from me, from him. That distinction mattered, because it wasn't that I had taken something from him. It was that the system had stopped giving him unquestioned access. He didn't understand why, and that confusion unsettled him more than anger ever could. I watched it happen quietly, not with satisfaction, but with distance. I didn't correct him when he complained. I didn't explain delays. I didn't hint at my involvement. I stayed exactly who I had always been on the surface. That's what made the shift so destabilizing for everyone else. At school, I noticed subtle changes too. Staff began addressing emails to both of us again. When I called, responses came faster. When I showed up, there was no pause. Authority, once restored, is rarely announced. It's felt. My husband noticed the difference, even if he couldn't articulate it. He became more guarded, asked more questions, started checking timelines, but by then, the sequence was already beyond his control. That's the thing about consequences that move through systems instead of people. They don't negotiate. I remember one moment clearly. We were sitting at the kitchen table again, the same light cutting across the surface, only this time he looked unsettled. He mentioned that a form had been rejected pending review. He didn't understand why. I looked at him and said, "That happens sometimes." Not dismissively, not pointedly, just factually. He nodded, but his expression stayed tight. What he was feeling then wasn't guilt. It was a loss of certainty. He had operated for so long under the assumption that things would move because he initiated them. That assumption had been quietly removed. Others began to feel it too. A family member mentioned confusion about a document they'd been copied on. A school administrator requested a joint meeting to align expectations, small things, reasonable things, but all of them signaled the same truth. The unilateral version of our family no longer held. I didn't step forward. I let the system rebalance itself. That was the hardest part, resisting the urge to explain, to clarify, to justify. But I understood now that explanation would reinsert emotion into a process that was finally correcting itself on facts alone. My husband began to ask more questions at home. "Did you hear anything from them? Did they mention why this is taking so long?" Each time I answered honestly but incompletely. "I haven't been contacted." They didn't say, which was true, because by then, I wasn't part of his process anymore. I had my own. The consequences weren't dramatic. There were no confrontations yet, no accusations, just friction. And friction is what happens when power meets resistance it didn't expect. I watched him struggle with that discomfort. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. Because for the first time, the ease he'd taken for granted was gone. And ease once removed is very hard to replace. Panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like sudden cooperation. That's how I knew it was too late. My husband didn't come to me angry. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice or demand answers. Instead, he softened. His tone changed. He started asking questions that sounded like collaboration but felt like repair. "Maybe we should loop you in on this," he said one evening, carefully. They're being weird about paperwork lately, he added. I think it might help if we present a united front. United. The word arrived late. For the first time in months, he was trying to reestablish jointness, not because he valued it, but because the absence of it was finally costing him something. I listened without reacting. I could see the calculation happening in real time, the way he was reassessing risk, the way he was trying to reinsert me into the narrative, not as an equal, but as reinforcement. But the system no longer worked that way. Once reviews are triggered, they don't respond to sentiment. They respond to the record. He began making small gestures of inclusion, forwarding emails, asking opinions, referring to decisions as ours again. It might have worked months earlier. Now it felt procedural. I didn't reject the gestures. I didn't challenge them. I acknowledged them politely, the same way one acknowledges an apology that comes after the damage is done. Because that's what this was. An attempt to rewind. At one point, he asked me directly if I'd noticed that things felt off lately. I met his eyes and said, sometimes processes change. Nothing more. His frustration deepened, not explosively, but inwardly. He couldn't locate the source of the resistance, which made it impossible to negotiate with. He couldn't argue with the system. He couldn't charm it. And he couldn't rush it. I watched him try. Phone calls that ended in, "We'll get back to you." Emails returned with requests for clarification. Meetings that produced no immediate resolution. Each time he came home more unsettled. At one point, he said something that stayed with me. I don't understand why this is happening now. That was the moment I knew it was irreversible. Because when someone believes they can still fix something, they ask how. When they realize they can't, they ask why. And why has no leverage. He suggested we consult someone together, that we get ahead of it, that we clarify misunderstandings. I didn't refuse. I simply said, we can see what happens. By then, the correction wasn't in our hands. It was already moving. What he didn't understand, and what I didn't explain, was that systems don't care about intentions after the fact. They care about consistency over time. And time was no longer on his side. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when I realized he was afraid. Not of me, of exposure, because when unilateral actions are reviewed, narratives collapse. And when narratives collapse, people are forced to face what they've done without the cushion of reinterpretation. He never asked me outright what I knew. That told me everything, because asking would have meant acknowledging the possibility that I had seen through him. And he wasn't ready for that. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt closure forming, like a door slowly, inevitably closing. Not slammed, not dramatic, just final. Whatever could have been fixed through conversation had already passed. This wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about consequence. And consequence doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with certainty. The confrontation didn't happen when I planned it. It happened when it no longer mattered. We were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table again, the same table that had quietly witnessed every shift in this story. There were no raised voices, no urgency, just the sound of the clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. He looked tired. Not physically, strategically. He finally said it then, carefully, like someone testing ice. I feel like you know something I don't. I didn't rush to answer. That pause did more than any accusation could have. Yes, I said eventually, just that. No elaboration, no defensiveness. His posture changed immediately. Not anger, alertness. He was used to conversations where I softened the edges, where I explained myself so he wouldn't feel uncomfortable. This was different. What do you know? He asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I didn't frame it as betrayal or hurt. I said, I know the birth certificate was amended without my consent. I know when it happened. I know how. Silence followed. Not denial, not outrage, just stillness. Because denial requires confidence, and his had already been eroded. I was going to tell you, he said finally. I nodded once. I know, I replied. That was the moment he understood he was no longer steering the conversation. I didn't argue with his explanation. I didn't challenge his reasoning. I didn't ask why, because why invites narrative, and narrative was no longer relevant. Instead, I said, you made a decision that removed me structurally. I responded structurally. He tried to speak. I raised my hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough. I'm not angry, I continued, and I'm not here to relive it emotionally. I need you to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a transfer of authority, and I corrected it. He looked at me then, not as the quiet, agreeable presence he'd grown used to, but as someone unfamiliar. You didn't talk to me, he said. No, I agreed. I followed your example. That landed harder than any accusation. He asked if things could be fixed. I considered the word carefully before answering. Things are already fixed, I said. just not in the way you expected. I explained, briefly, factually, that the systems now recognized both parents fully again. Those reviews had been triggered, that unilateral changes would no longer pass unnoticed. I didn't mention lawyers. I didn't threaten consequences. I didn't outline futures. I didn't need to. The power shift was already evident. He asked what this meant for us. I told him the truth. It means that whatever happens next will be decided with full transparency, or not at all. No ultimatum, no drama. Just a boundary. He nodded slowly, absorbing the finality. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Because confrontation without heat doesn't seek dominance. It establishes reality. And reality, once spoken calmly and backed by structure, doesn't need reinforcement. We didn't resolve everything that night. We didn't need to. The imbalance had been corrected. The truth was on the table. And the silence between us was no longer loaded with omission. It was honest. That was enough. I am quieter now than I was before, not because I've retreated, but because I no longer need to prove presence. Something fundamental changed after that conversation, though it wasn't visible in the ways people expect transformation to look. I didn't become sharper-tongued. I didn't start asserting myself loudly. I didn't trade one extreme for another. What changed was internal alignment. For the first time in a long while, my inner understanding and my external actions matched. I no longer over-explain. I no longer smooth discomfort that isn't mine to manage. I no longer interpret silence as safety. That shift has altered how people relate to me, even when they can't articulate why. At school, I'm addressed directly now. Not because I demand it, but because my presence is unmistakable. When I speak, it's precise. When I ask questions, they're specific. There's no excess emotion to distract from the point. Authority doesn't announce itself. It settles. At home, the dynamic changed too, not dramatically, not explosively, but permanently. Conversations are slower, more careful. Decisions are discussed rather than assumed. Not because I insisted on it, because the assumption no longer works. My husband sees me differently now. Not as opposition, but as someone whose silence has weight. He doesn't summarize decisions anymore. He asks, and when he doesn't, I don't fill in the gaps for him. That's the difference. I no longer rescue people from the discomfort of mutual responsibility. As a mother, the change feels even more important. I'm present in a way that isn't just logistical. I'm modeling something I didn't know how to articulate before. That care does not require self-erasure. That calm does not mean consent. That love doesn't mean surrendering your place. Our child doesn't know the details of what happened, and doesn't need to. What they see instead is subtle, but powerful. Both parents acknowledged, both voices recognized, no one operating in the shadows. That matters more than any explanation. I also see myself differently now, not as the quiet one, not as easygoing, not as the background support holding everything together invisibly. I see myself as someone who understands systems and understands herself. Someone who knows that restraint is only virtuous when it's chosen, not assumed. I don't regret being patient. Patience taught me how to see clearly, but I no longer confuse patience with permission. There's no bitterness in me about what happened. Bitterness requires attachment to an outcome that didn't materialize. What I feel instead is grounded, because I know now that if something shifts beneath my feet, I will notice. If something is taken quietly, I will trace it. If a line is crossed, I will respond, not emotionally, but decisively. And I won't need to announce it. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder, just unmistakably present. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain and a victor. But real life doesn't offer that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead is a lesson, quiet, durable, and often uncomfortable. What happened to me wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it didn't come with threats or ultimatums. It happened through systems, assumptions, and the quiet confidence of someone who believed my silence meant absence. And for a long time, I helped maintain that illusion, not because I was weak, but because I believed harmony required sacrifice. That stability came from smoothing edges. That love meant trusting even when something felt off. What I learned is this: silence is not neutral. Silence teaches people what they can do without consequence. Silence becomes precedent. Silence, when misread, turns into permission. But silence can also be something else. It can be an observation. It can be preparation. It can be a restraint paired with clarity. The difference is choice. The moral of this story isn't be louder. It isn't never trust. It isn't even fight back. It's this: know when your quiet is serving your values, and when it's serving someone else's convenience. Power doesn't always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives smiling, efficient, and just handling things. And when it does, the most dangerous thing you can do is assume intent matters more than impact. What protected me in the end wasn't anger. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't even being believed. It was understanding how the world actually works and choosing to respond within that reality instead of the one I wished I were in. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't explode. I corrected the record. And sometimes that's the most powerful form of justice there is. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to announce your boundaries for them to exist. You don't have to perform your pain for it to be valid. And you don't have to be loud to be unmovable. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about clarity. Before we end, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was costing you your place? If you have, I'd like to hear your story in the comments. And if you haven't, I hope you remember this one the moment silence starts asking too much of you.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.